You showed up today, warrior. Awesome. Okay, today we're reading Doctrine and Covenants, section 74, or I should say right now we're reading, because we could totally read more in one day than 7 verses, but we can also just read the 7 verses, which is fine. Okay, so the preface here in section 74 is this. It says, revelation given to Joseph Smith the prophet at Wayne County, New York in 1830. Even before the organization of the church, questions had arisen about the proper mode of baptism, leading the prophet to seek answers on the subject. Joseph Smith history states that this revelation is an explanation of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 14, a scripture that had often been used to justify infant baptism. Okay, that's good. That's good, because we have questions about that too, right? Okay. So section 74. So in addition to questions, this is just a little historical background. In addition to questions regarding infant baptism, spouses have, or infant baptism found in 1 Corinthians 7:14 also helps us understand what responsibility spouses have when joining the church. One Doctrine and Covenants commentary explains, in the Corinthian church, some evidently held that when the husband and or wife had been converted, he or she ought to abandon the unconverted partner as unclean and contaminating. Not at all. St. Paul says, in substance, that the conversion of one of the partners has brought a sanctifying influence into the family. And this is Hiram M. Smith and Jane M. Sodal. Anyway, Doctrine and Covenants commentary 432. So Paul taught that the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Or perhaps, in other words, the spouse who joins the church and makes covenants with the Lord is a blessing, not a hindrance to the other. Paul is telling the believing spouse to be a blessing to the other. Use the covenants and the things they have learned to lift the companionship and family, not destroy it. Ooh, I love that, because sometimes we wonder, right, about that. Like, oh, only one of the, only, the husband or the wife is a member, they should leave, But I love that this is what they say, that it's that one person can sanctify the family, can be that instrument, right? So anyway, and then back to the infant baptism. Because the situation is unclear, it is not known what brought about this revelation. Since the revelation was received soon after the restoration of the church, it is likely that the Lord was correcting a misunderstanding of the scriptures in that 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 14, since the Lord quotes that scripture in this verse 1. Okay. And this is what Christian churches use to justify infant baptism. As the Lord's gospel was being restored, he revealed to Joseph his will on the matter. Okay, so nobody really knows exactly the question that arose, but I feel like they've had so many children die back in the day early on because of all of these problems that they used to have with their health, and they didn't have remedies or things like that back then, or medicine or shots, or the immune, now I can't remember what they're called. It's the shots you get before you go to school kind of thing. Anyways, they didn't have those back then, and so I think a lot more children were dying back then. It's not even I know a lot more children were dying back then. And so I bet the question arose in a bunch of Christian families was, are my children saved? Are my children going to be safe with the Lord? Are my children going to the Lord? Where are they going? Because I know I'm supposed to be baptized. Does that mean they're supposed to be baptized? So I don't think it was necessarily people are trying to be malicious in this, I think it was just they were trying to protect their family, who wouldn't? Okay, so Doctrine and Covenants 74, here we go. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. Right? Okay, so Joseph had learned the abomination of infant baptism when he translated Moroni 8 in Moroni, or verses 11 to 22. In Moroni 8, Mormon wrote a letter to Moroni explaining that children cannot be unholy. So imagine how that 1 Corinthians 7:14 might have sounded to those who supported infant baptisms. What was Paul's teaching? What was he teaching, that children are unholy until they are baptized? Joseph knew that could not be correct. So this is what happened, okay? So now, verse 2. Now in the days of the apostles, the law of circumcision was had among all the Jews who believed not the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it came to pass that there arose a great contention among the people concerning the law of circumcision. For the unbelieving husband was desirous that his children should be circumcised and become subject to the law of Moses, which law was fulfilled. And it came to pass that the children, being brought up in subjection to the law of Moses, gave heed to the traditions of their fathers, and believed not the gospel of Christ, wherein they became unholy. Wherefore, for this cause the apostle wrote unto the church, giving unto them a commandment, not of the Lord, but of himself, that a believer should not be united to an unbeliever, except the law of Moses should be done away among them, that their children might remain without circumcision, and that the tradition might be done away, which saith that little children are unholy, for it was had among the Jews. But little children are holy, being sanctified through the atonement of Jesus Christ. And that is what the scriptures mean. Okay, so in the days of Paul, they were living in a society of Jews who still believed in the law of Moses, and the Christians who were doing away with many things within that law. So this brought a lot of contention within families who believed different things. For example, a Jewish husband might want his son circumcised, while the mother found that unnecessary. Paul saw the hardship this would cause within families and taught of the sanctifying effect that a believer had upon their family. So Robert J. Matthews explains this. Quote, there is no doubt that Peter and the other brethren knew that the law of Moses was fulfilled. Obedience to the law of Moses was no longer a requirement for salvation, since Jesus had completed his atonement. Missionary work among the Gentiles nations could go forth directly and without impediment. Yet still there was that conflict between the doctrine of the church and Jewish culture. The long-standing cultural tradition persisted among many Jewish members for years, even after the doctrinal question was settled, end quote. So this is in A Crisis, a Council and Inspired Leadership, Ensign, October 1995. So the issue that Paul brought up was that if there was an unbelieving father, the children might follow in his footsteps and become unholy when they reach the age of accountability. This was a problem that Paul was pointing out. Therefore, it was better for believers to be united with believers so that children were not taught conflicting commandments. Elder Donald L. Hallstrom used this scripture to teach about making certain that we are not leading our children away from important ordinances that they need. He taught this, quote, the prophet Joseph Smith was inspired to clarify one of Paul's epistles to the people of Corinth by saying, and it came to pass that the children being brought up in subjection to the law of Moses gave heed to the traditions of their fathers and believed not the gospel of Christ, wherein they became unholy. Please be not dismissive and think this principle applies only to the others and their culture. Know that it is valid for you and for me, wherever on earth we may live or whatever our family circumstances may be. Unwanted traditions are those which lead us away from performing holy ordinances and keeping sacred covenants. Our guide should be the doctrine taught by the scriptures and the prophets. Traditions which devalue marriage and family, abase women, or do not recognize the majesty of their God-given roles, honor temporal successes more than spiritual, or teach that reliance upon God is a weakness of character, all lead us away from eternal truths. Of all the traditions we should cultivate within ourselves and our families, a tradition of righteousness could be preeminent. That's what it is. Let's say that again. Of all the traditions we could cultivate within ourselves and our families, a tradition of righteousness can be preeminent. In a world where traditions often confuse right and wrong, we are inspired by the courage of each young person who has honored the Sabbath day, kept the word of wisdom, and remained chaste when popular culture has established the opposite as not only acceptable but expected. We are inspired by the wisdom of each man who has molded a career which properly supports his premier responsibility to spiritually lead his family when wealth and power are more highly valued by the world. We are inspired by the nobility of each husband and wife who have established a relationship of equality and kindness when one of selfishness and indifference is so common. End quote. Elder Donald L. Hallstrom, Cultivate Righteous Traditions, Liahona, January 2001. Whew, nice. So, like, I think as a married spouse myself, it is so important that we can establish a relationship of equality and kindness, even when we have differing opinions, different beliefs, different cultures. I remember something that my husband and I talked about when we were first married was like, what are we going to do for Christmas, right? Because that is a Christian tradition, but our culture to celebrate Christmas is a Christian tradition for us, right? But then in my culture, which is a Hispanic culture that comes from Peru, they celebrated the most during the time between 10 p.m. and like 2 o'clock in the morning. Now, this is just a culture. This is not this is not doctrine, okay? But that was my culture. It was like, that's when I celebrated. That's what we did when we were young. And so it was just like, I was growing up with it. So it was a tradition and it was part of culture, but it was not doctrine, okay? And then my husband grew up here in America where they celebrate Christmas at what time? 6 a.m. or whatever time the kids want to wake up to wake their parents up. So while I was celebrating between 10 p.m. Christmas Eve I guess it probably starts more like 8 p.m. Christmas Eve to 2 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Day, right? And then the American tradition is to celebrate like as early as possible on Christmas Day. And then just throughout the day, you have like your Christmas breakfast. Like, I don't know, kids open the presents, Christmas breakfast. Okay, so I'm just giving an example of like traditions, right? That easily could have been something that our family, that like when we first got married, could have caused contention if we didn't approach it with like equality and kindness and respect, right? And so I wanted to honor his traditions, but he also wanted to honor my traditions. And so it was kind of crazy, but we ended up doing like a half, right? So like we would go and celebrate with my family on Christmas Eve. And then, on Christmas Day, we would have some kind of celebration with his family. But then apparently his family did other stuff on Christmas Eve. And so then we ended up having to start trading off. And with my family being divorced and stuff, it was really hard at the beginning because I'd have to go, nobody wanted to go celebrate with the grandpa or with my dad and with my grandma, but then nobody wanted to invite them because of the divorce. And so it was like such a hard thing. And so my husband was so kind and very patient with the whole system that we tried to set up. And well, now it's a little bit easier. But because now my dad and my grandma live in Peru, and so we don't necessarily need to celebrate with them in person anymore unless we choose to go over there, which is very expensive, by the way. But we try and do different celebrations throughout. And so like now, like my husband's family will do like a Christmas celebration that's like 2 weeks earlier than Christmas. And then my family will still do every year. It's like my brother and his family will gather the family to do the Christmas tradition at their house on Christmas Eve night. And so it's like we try to take turns. And then there's the aspect of like, now I'm just like a little older and I don't want to stay up all night because I still got to wrap presents at night. So it's like, when am I going to wrap presents? So it's usually the night before Christmas Day, and that's when everybody's trying to have a party. But you know what I mean? So it's like one of those things that you just got to find what works best for you and your spouse. And then however you want to plan, the people that where you're going to go to is like after, right? It's like you and your spouse are here together doing the thing. And then people outside of your union come second, not first. Does that make sense? Okay, so anyways, that was really long explanation of our Christmas our Christmas celebration. So now I'm going to read it, love it here for us for section 74. Here it is. And so it says, sometimes we need the reminder that little children are holy. The Lord loves them. See them with those eyes. I love that. And it is like, it's funny because we have the age of 8 being the accountable age. And I don't know, sometimes even the 8-year-olds feel super holy to me, you know? And I'm just like, what about, maybe it's more when they become a teenager that, but even then I still consider, like, there's those moments where I'm just like, yeah, they're still so innocent. Like anytime, even like up until, I don't even know, 18 or whatever, I'm just like, we just have to have patience with each other. I think that's really what it is. It's just have patience with each other to try and learn the things that we need to learn that God is trying to teach us. Because yeah, I feel like if I think about myself and the dumb choices I've made throughout life, and I want to talk to myself in the past, I just have so much patience and love for myself from now having experienced this much life, and versus like back when I was trying to learn stuff, you know, it's like, oh, of course I'm going to have so much patience with them. And I don't necessarily blame myself or like look at myself in like a super evil way, or like that I was trying to be the worst, you know, or I was trying to sin on purpose, or, you know what I mean? Like, does that even make sense? I don't think I'm making sense. Anyway, so I just feel like we just need to have more patience with our children, because they're just trying to do the best that they can with the knowledge that they have, and think about how many years they have been alive on the earth, right? And it's like, it's our first time being their parent. And so let's have patience with ourselves too. And so it's just like, if we could just all be patient with each other, I think it would be better. And I think that's what the Lord is trying to say, you know, because he's like the one that's always extending mercy to us. And if we could extend each other that same mercy that the Lord extends each of us, the world would be a better place, right? Okay, anyways, that is it for section 74. Until section 75, stay strong, warrior.